All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Jordan Jackson. I'm the Recruiting Services Manager in the Career Development Center here at Appalachian State University. And I'm doing this presentation as part of a series of career meetups that our office has been doing um, to just kind of give an idea of how our campus has been impacted by coronavirus and all the other happenings of this crazy year. It's my job in the Career Development Center to kind of keep an eye on all the jobs that get posted to our Handshake system and make sure those are legitimate and that they get approved so that our students and alumni can apply for them. So I kind of have a unique perspective in an advantageous kind of way to observe this information as it happens in real time. And so I'm just going to share some of the findings that I've been able to document about how recruiting at App State has been affected. And we'll go ahead and get started. So the purpose of my presentation here is kind of to take a look at this past 7 months. The coronavirus pandemic, for all intents and purposes, began in March of this year on a national level, at least. Of course, it was bad in other countries before that, but it was in early mid-March that President Trump went on television and basically we started the shutdowns and kind of the, for lack of a better word, panic around COVID-19. And that's when we knew and started to see that employers were going to start getting impacted in the way that they recruit, in the way that they hire. And so over the past 7 months, I've kind of been able to observe this by the way that we get new job postings and employer requests and just kind of measure them against previous data to see if we are getting fewer jobs in now, are we getting more, what type of jobs are we getting, what type of employers are we getting, what kind of questions can we answer based on the data. 2020 has brought about unprecedented change in the workplace, layoffs, furloughs, closures even, and cliched terms like unprecedented change. So we're going to look specifically at which industries and employers are continuing to recruit from App State in Handshake and at what volume, how many jobs are being posted on Handshake and what type of jobs are they, and just how bad is it for App State students and graduates who are going through this right now. And we'll look into a little more as well. But before we get started, just want to give a brief overview of how Handshake figures into all of this. The reason I'm keeping this presentation limited to impacts on App State is because that's really the only data that I have easy, verifiable access to by looking at our Handshake account. So employers use Handshake to connect with universities like ours for their recruiting purposes. And our office then can choose to either approve or deny those employers. And if approved, as most are, employers can then post their openings on Handshake for students and alumni who use their Handshake accounts to then view those jobs and apply for them if they want. In addition to the employers getting approved, there's also an approval process for each individual job they submit to Handshake. It's my job to oversee that process. The great majority of these job postings are legitimate and approved. We do have some standards that must be met, and if they don't meet those standards in their job posting, the job posting gets declined. So it can't be international, can't be a third-party recruiting thing, it can't be a pyramid scheme, just those sorts of things. But most postings do get approved. And these approval requests for both employers and jobs are usually handled pretty promptly and with regularity, though they can be impacted by various factors. Most of the approvals are handled by student employees in our office, so the regularity with which we address these approvals can be impacted by holiday breaks. It can be impacted just by workload if those student employees or myself have other things that we have to work on at the time. But for the most part, we can pretty regularly get to these approvals to allow for a pretty well patterned system of addressing these approvals. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the last 7 months of 2020 and really compare it to the same 7 months from a year ago when there wasn't a pandemic happening. So if we look at March through October, again, we're using March because that's when the pandemic really started to take a toll in America. But if we look at March 2019 through October 19, we had almost 16,000 jobs posted to Handshake and approved. We had 8,659 new employers approved in Handshake as of October 2019, and 1,123 of those employers were approved between March and October. So all these numbers are going to be kind of jumbly gobbledygook for now, but we're going to dive into them here in a few minutes. So just kind of keep them in your head for now, as much as you can. We look at 2020 now, March through October, almost exactly the same number of jobs. There's a difference of 72 jobs, I believe, posted to Handshake and approved since March 17, 2020, as there were between March and October of 2019. And we're looking at almost 16,000 again. The number of employers has increased by 830 since October 2019, bringing our new total to 9,489. So that's 369 new employers approved since March 17th, 2020. So what are the conclusions we can draw from this? Well, the rate of employer approvals has slowed, and the number of approved jobs, as I mentioned a moment ago, is relatively the same. So if we put 2 and 2 together there, our rate of employer approvals has gone up. It always increases because it's cumulative, yet our jobs have stayed relatively the same. So even though that rate of employer approvals has gone up, it's done so at a slower pace, and we're not seeing a similar increase in jobs, which is a concern. It stands to reason that we should see a similar increase in jobs as we see with employers, and we're not seeing that. So let's take a closer look at this data now and focus specifically on employers first. So as I said before, employer approvals are cumulative. They don't ever go down. Something would be very, very wrong if the total number of employers connected with us in Handshake actually went down. So that doesn't happen. It is going up. It should go up. It should always be going up. It is going up slightly slower than it had been. So from October 17th, 2019 to October 16th, 2020, the total increased from 8,659 to 9,489. So that's a rate of 9.6% increase. One thing to note, during that time, 55.5% of those employers came in before the onset of coronavirus, which was only 5 months. The other 7 months of that year-long period would constitute the 44.5% remaining. So break that down. Most of the employers came in the 5 months before coronavirus. The rest came in the 7 months after, a smaller amount. And so in the months leading up to the COVID-19 outbreak, we had an average of 92.2 employer approvals per month. So that's where this line graph here starts at 92.2. And you can see when COVID hits in March, that number plummets down to just above 50 per month. And it kind of zigzags around that 50 mark, really up until now. It's actually on its lowest number now than it has been throughout this whole process. I don't think that's necessarily a reason to shatter the glass and sound the alarm. But we have not gotten back up to that level of 92.2 employer approvals per month that we saw before the pandemic. And the thing about employer approvals is that employer approvals can kind of give us an idea of what types of jobs are getting posted in Handshake. So as much as I'd love to do a graph that shows the industry that each job approval we get matches to, that's just too much data. So the graph you're looking at now has all 62 industries that are options on Handshake. And the blue bar shows us how many employers in that industry were approved in 2019, while the orange bar shows us 2020. And it's lower in all but one category for whatever reason. Down here at the very end, we see that forestry actually had either the same or slightly more jobs or slightly more employers in 2020 than in 2019. But that doesn't matter. What we see is a decrease, as evidenced by the data I've already presented. But what really concerns us is not if an industry is seeing a decrease in the number of employers getting approved, it's whether there's a big difference or not. So I'm not all that concerned about most of these, but if you look at something like, for example, human resources, human resources has a pretty significant difference between where it was in 2020 and where it is now in 2019. That's probably not a great one to use as an example because the HR resource or the HR industry is often third-party recruiters, and we don't allow third-party recruiting on our Handshake system. So let's look at another example, performing arts. No surprise there. Performing arts has been hit really hard by coronavirus. They're not even having Broadway shows until 2021, I don't think. So we see a pretty significant drop-off in approved employers in the performing and fine arts industry from 2019 to now. Other example, research, movies, TV, music, which is kind of along the performing arts line as well. What else do we see? Hotels and accommodation, another big difference there, and that one's also very obvious. Tourism and and leisure and that sort of thing, accommodations, really hit hard by coronavirus. Hospitality, that's the word I'm looking for. So that's been hit hard as well. On the converse, you can see ones that maybe we shouldn't be as concerned about. Construction still going strong. There's a difference there, but not like when you compare it to all these other industries, it's getting along pretty well. Construction is doing well. Utilities and renewable energy doing well. Other agriculture, architecture and planning, electronic and computer hardware. We're just not seeing as much of a drop off with these industries as we are with others when it comes to employers from those industries requesting approval to connect with Appalachian State University. Now, again, this is employers, not jobs, but I feel like if we look at these employer numbers, it'll give us a good idea of the type of jobs that are getting posted in Handshake too. Because again, to do a graph like this with just jobs was just too much data for Handshake reports to handle. So it stands to reason that the more employers in a certain industry that we see, the more jobs we'll see in that industry as well. So this tells us that construction jobs are still coming in pretty regularly compared to where they were a year ago, and performing arts are not, and so on and so forth, as we've already discussed. So, as I said before, the number of approved jobs has been relatively same between 2019 and 2020, but that actually represents a downturn in job posting activity because, as I said before, we've seen a rise in employer approvals, and we have not seen a corresponding rise in job approvals as we would like to see. In fact, as I said before, there's a 9.6 increase in total approved employers and a 0.5% decrease in the amount of approved jobs. But when you take both of those into account together, what we should consider is that without a significant disruption, we should have gotten over 1,500 more jobs approved over the March to October 2020 timeframe than we've actually observed. And because we have not had that, we've actually observed an 8.8% decrease in job posting activity when you take into account that employer approvals are up at 9.6%. So now we'll look at job approvals. I have a graph here that shows us job approvals from 2019 compared to 2020 from the March to October time period again. as I said in previous slides, we really want to see 2020 a good bit above the 2019 line because we have so many more employers. Not a drastic rise, but still a rise, and we want to see a corresponding rise with jobs, and we're not seeing that. In fact, 2020 dipped lower than 2019, mostly during the late spring and summer when coronavirus was really wreaking the most havoc on employers and their recruiting abilities. So not only are we not above the 2019 line during those months as we'd like to be, we're in fact below it. But there is reason for hope because you see from July to August here, we see a very steep increase in the number of jobs being posted and approved in Handshake. And that's continuing really up to this day. This is more where we want to be or even above where we want to be in comparison to 2019. So this is a good sign here in the last 2 months that we're so much higher than we were in 2019 in the same category of standard job approvals. And so when I say standard job approvals, what that means are jobs as opposed to internships or fellowships or co-ops. I have another graph for internships, fellowships, and co-ops right here. And it shows a fairly similar trend here. You could probably say that internships were hit a little bit harder at the very beginning of coronavirus pandemic, but they've made an even bigger rebound here in the last month or two. If we look at this graph, we see that we have been above the 2019 mark in all but one month, and that's good. Maybe not as substantially above it as we'd like to in a few places. But one thing to consider is that with the coronavirus pandemic causing the economic hardships that it has for employers, maybe some of their full-time jobs got converted to internships or other, temporary seasonal sort of jobs that would be included in this category here. But the main thing that we see here that's similar to the standard jobs graph that we just look at is a huge rebound from July to August. This one's even steeper than the standard jobs. It's actually accompanied by another fairly steep decline here from August to September, but we're still way up from where we were over the summer, and we're still at a really kind of about where we want to be over 2019 when you consider how many more employers we have in Handshake. So again, there's reason for optimism when we look at these last 2 months here. So that's great. We'll move on here. So final conclusion, as well as a note. As I mentioned before, jobs and internships in Handshake are actually down a slight number from where they were a year ago. But if you were clever or observant, you noticed in those graphs that I just showed that doesn't make sense, that they were actually up, and you'd be right. Jobs and internships are indeed up from a year ago when not taking on-campus and volunteer jobs into account. So the numbers I presented at the very beginning of this presentation did include on-campus and volunteer jobs. You take those out of the equation, we're not going down anymore, we're going up. Because if you remember, there was only a 72 job difference between 2019 and 2020. So that's enough for those two categories to make up the difference. It doesn't really matter though, because we still want to be up significantly from where we are when you take into account that we've had growth among employers. But that's what accounts for the apparent disagreement between the statistics I presented at the very beginning and the statistics that are depicted by those graphs I just showed. In any case, we want to see that corresponding rise in job postings to go along with the rise in employer approvals. And we had not seen that really in the spring or certainly the summer when our numbers were really kind of dipping below or at least staying consistent with the 2019 level in some cases. But from July to August and from August to September, we're seeing a considerable rebound, both among standard jobs, as well as internships, fellowships, and co-ops. So that is something to be optimistic about. I hope we can see that continue, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel, it appears. We got about 5 minutes left in this presentation that I'd really set aside for questions. And seeing that there is not a live audience right now, I will go ahead and just conclude this. But again, my name is Jordan Jackson. I'm the Recruiting Services Manager in the Career Development Center here at Appalachian State. And if you're watching this down the line sometime, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email, jacksonjr@appstate.edu if you have any questions or concerns. I'd love to talk about these numbers. I had a lot of fun putting them together, even though they were sometimes scary and sad. But like I said, we see some reason for optimism here in the last couple months. So it was good to come across that and put that together and present it to you here today. So thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great fall. Bye-bye.